computer. Okay, here we are with Dr. Benjamin Zaitchik, who is a professor and climate scientist at the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. Thank you for meeting me. I first learned about your work in the article by Aman Azhar in Inside Climate News. For anybody who wants to look it up, it's titled "From the Middle East to East Baltimore, a Johns Hopkins professor works to make the city more climate resilient." And I was just fascinated with the article, with the work you do. You study extreme weather, particularly with a focus on urban heat islands, and also, I think very importantly, to analyze possibilities to create resilience, which is so time relevant. It's so important for urbanism right now, for the growing urban population. At Pedestrian Space, I'm really looking to hone in focus on environmental aspects of creating more walkable environments too. And as many of us know, urban heat islands are a really serious issue. And I was very interested in talking to you as an expert. So thank you.
Thanks for having me. Yeah,
absolutely. If you don't mind sharing just a little bit about how you got into that field.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, as you mentioned, my background is in climate science. And so I've been interested in kind of, humans' ability to thrive in a challenging climate environment for a long time, with a lot of work on things like food production, food security, water resources. And then heat wasn't necessarily that much a focus for me until some of my close colleagues who work on urban issues and particularly on health in urban and non-urban environments really drew my attention to it. Because I think, like so many of us, heat bothers me when I have to experience it, but I don't fully appreciate its impact. Right? We call heat the silent killer. Right here in the United States, it is on average the deadliest form of climate extreme year on year. Right? But people don't think of it. They think about tornadoes, hurricanes, floods. And so when you think about that, when you start appreciating just how deadly heat can be and how deaths are just the tip of the iceberg, like what it does for your ability to enjoy life, to other health impacts like asthma and other complications people find on hot days, it's really a big deal. And so I got interested in trying to understand it a little more and work with folks who are doing such great work to try to minimize exposure to heat.
Right, and as I understand, your work also led you into leaning into some environmental justice issues, which also really interested me because you're coming from this standpoint of a researcher, but then looking at the environmental justice issues related to urban heat.
Yeah, and so urban heat's a huge environmental justice issue. And, so again, I'll speak from the United States context first, since that's what I know best, but it's been demonstrated. Well, first of all, it's just obvious in lived experience. And then it's demonstrated in research that places where historically marginalized and excluded communities tend to live within the urban environment are hotter. And why is that? Well, there's a lot more impervious area, there's fewer trees. Sometimes there's less investment and maintenance of green spaces that people can take advantage of. And then on top of that, those are places where you might be dealing with energy poverty or just poverty in general. So people don't have access to air conditioning or the resources to turn on the air conditioner, right? Because that costs money. And so you end up with disproportionate exposure to extreme heat in these communities. And so it's just the environmental justice element is just inherent to thinking about heat. And I also note that the United States, where we've looked at this in cities, it's not just a city issue. We've also done some work with poor communities in rural areas in the United States. And those communities have some serious issues as well, again, because of these energy poverty issues. So even though you might have an urban heat island, right, where it gets hotter in the city, it still gets hot outside of the city. And that can be a big deal. Finally, thinking about this in other contexts, I think in recent years in particular, there's been a greater appreciation of the impacts that heat's having in some subtropical and tropical regions in less developed countries. And we've been working a lot with folks, certainly in understanding some of the exposure elements in places like India. South Asia's had some terrible heat waves in recent years. and also in cities in East Africa, which have not traditionally viewed heat as one of their major priorities, but where we're seeing things like temperatures being higher in some of the informal settlements in these cities, right? So again, the poorer communities there, the more exposed communities also experiencing higher heat conditions. Yet another instance of this kind of environmental injustice of heat exposure.
Do you think there's a shift in awareness? As I understand, this year, a lot of heat wave records have been broken across the world. Is that correct?
Yes, and it will continue to be true probably every year for the rest of our lives, yes.
Right. So do you think that there is a shift in awareness across the spectrum governmentally? I mean, of course, researchers are tuned into this and they're studying it, but from what are you seeing in terms of governmental attention and action?
Right. So certainly the public is more attuned to it, and the media, and that's coupled, and local governments, absolutely. So a city that I live in, Baltimore, in the United States, has had heat as the top issue in its kind of disaster prevention preparedness plans for a number of years. But the emphasis on that and I think the will to do something about it has certainly risen in recent years. And I think we're seeing this a lot, with cities around the world, thinking about the urban heat issue. There's a lot of energy, positive energy in terms of trying to address this issue. How that propagates to, broader issues of climate policy at things like federal level or at the international negotiations, that's as we all know, a difficult, complicated situation that depends on the country.
Exactly, that's true. In the article I referenced earlier where I learned about your work, I really like how the author referenced that you found the perfect workshop, the rest of the city. And I appreciate how you also mentioned that urban heat is an issue, not only in the city, but in rural areas too. But this reference of the workshop being the rest of the city, with my work at Pedestrian Space, I see the city as a laboratory, including the unwalkable areas, because if a city has the perfect 10 for walkability, there's no need for change. And there's many cities across the planet that do not have perfect scores and that need a lot of work. And sort of the central thesis at Pedestrian Space is looking at sustainable urban development through the lens of walkability, which includes so many factors. But I'm extremely interested in the issue of urban heat, because if it's too hot, people don't want to walk. Ironically, they're then hopping into air-conditioned cars if they have those. So it's really important. It's sort of course, as we know, really interconnected. And so as I focus have this pretty niche focus with walkability, there's these many dimensions that expand out to a greener city is a more walkable city as well. And it's an investment in public health, which I am not sure how much urban heat for the public is also understood as a public health, although we all know on an individual level how we feel in blistering heat. So what are your thoughts about that narrative, bringing that narrative more into focus about public health?
I think that's right. It's a major public health issue that's underappreciated, though I think people are getting it more these days. And also really understanding how we do the right scale. I think about all the impacts, like you just listed, I think a half dozen really important things here, right? Walkability, the need to get into an air-conditioned place, which is maladaptive, right? Both from a climate perspective and your own health, if you're sitting in an air-conditioned place. Your ability to engage in certain activities. And so how do we then think about this when we're talking about, intervening to work to help to reduce the urban heat island? At what scale? With what kinds of interventions? So just to give one example, with your great work on the pedestrian factor, having trees, right, that provide not just a reduction in temperature, but also shade, which is a related but somewhat different issue, right? And having those trees in such a manner that they make it pleasant to walk, they don't obstruct, right? So the kind of maintenance you have, so the branches aren't, obstructing the way. Doing this in a thoughtful and participatory way, I think, is really important in order to target the interventions. Because as you say, we think about the city as this kind of workshop, this collaborative laboratory. And what's so important in that, as I know in emphasizing your work, is that it's not a laboratory that you come in and study, right, with a bunch of lab mice, right? No, far from it. It's it's all of us together. We live in these cities, right? And so it's a laboratory for all of us to work together on. And that, I think, is a really exciting opportunity, as kind of breaking down those barriers between the researchers, the community, the city, but saying, no, like this is our space, right? And how do the people who live in this space feel the power and the knowledge to change the space they're living in, right, when they want to do so, and so treating it as their lab, not that they're inside a lab.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's a great thing to clarify. The laboratory is our life, and that's how I look at it. So I see you referencing it as that as well. So earlier, before I started recording, we were also, you mentioned that, quote, unlike so much in the climate space, there really is something we can do about urban heat islands. So I would love to hear from you what some of those thoughts are. You already mentioned the interventions that are thoughtful and participatory. It would be great to hear about that also at Pedestrian Space. As I really bring into focus urban heat, I look to also spotlight people and spotlight projects that are doing good work related to mitigating the effects of urban heat across the world and cities across the world. So I would love to hear some of your ideas about on a positive, that's a really positive and constructive note, because I think some people can be sitting out there, just individuals, wondering, well, how do I do anything about this?
Yeah, and it is really exciting to see, certainly in my city, and I think in other cities, how individuals and communities are able to change this. And so, just to give some examples from our city, and quite honestly, there are many cities in the world that are ahead of Baltimore. Right, Baltimore is working through many challenges, including the urban heat island. But to see these communities come together and develop their own greening plans, right, aligned with the priorities they have. Sometimes that's walkability, right? Sometimes that comes up on top. Like, we want to be able to walk down the streets, and that's really important, not just because I want to be able to walk comfortably down the street, temperature-wise, but because the more people that are walking down the street, obviously that has a positive knock-on effect on commerce, on business and community, and on public safety, right? When the streets are full of people, diverse people walking around about their daily business. And so there's a real emphasis there, and you can do this with, greening is a big element, traffic calming associated with buffers between, all of the good practices that, you've looked into, and how you make a walkable area. And then also multi-purpose work. So we've been working with some folks in our city. We have a lot of vacancies. We have a lot of, as city urban development has shifted around, we have places with vacant homes or tear downs that become lots. And it's like, well, what do you do with that lot? And then if that can be an area that is both greened in a way that helps reduce heat and also has a community garden or a playground or some destination of interest, right? Then you're enhancing the community so much more. And it's an exciting thing for communities to work on, right? And then it takes the buy-in, right? It takes the local heroes who are really gonna see this through, do what it takes to get the resources, maintain, volunteer, because especially when you're talking about green infrastructure solutions, the urban heat island, which are some of the best solutions because of their multiple values. It's true that, that takes maintenance, it takes care. And so you need people within the community and or within the city government who are going to say, okay, we're going to make sure this place stays, continues to grow into a destination and a lovely spot, as opposed to becoming a headache for people who need to then feel like that things are not being maintained.
Right. And I liked how you referenced to earlier that the public and the media are attuned to it, and city governments are attuned to it, which means they are more likely to devote municipal resources than to maintenance of green space. Correct?
Yeah.
Right. So say I have just a hypothetical, say you see a vacant lot and you're not sure who is in control of it, or what's going to happen with it, but you want to approach maybe the municipality. I mean, maybe it's already snapped up by a developer, but as a citizen, it's possible to maybe contact the municipality and find out what the plans are. My question is, if a municipality is resistant or if development plans are underway, it's sort of seeing the value of green space. Maybe if it's difficult to convince whoever the stakeholders are that this space will have value as a green space rather than a business, not yet another, maybe yet another, commercial structure. Not that commercial entities can't exist, they can throughout a green space. But if you understand what I'm saying, do you have any thoughts on that? Like kind of the persuading how valuable green space is for a community.
Right. And so, yeah, it's a really strong point because there's competing demands on space in a city. And so I think that I'll approach that a couple of ways. One way is simply the governance issue, right? And that depends a lot on your town, right? It's about how do things work. So, to your hypothetical, if you see this lot and what's happening with it, if that happens to me in Baltimore, we have very much a neighborhood structure. So I would work through my neighborhood association to find out what's going on, my city council member, and then up from there, right? So there's that local approach. And then similarly, if we see a systematic problem that needs change in zoning or procedures, things like that, you would work it up from your local neighborhood to the city government. That might be different in different cities, and you might have different kinds of responses at the city level, right? Depends on the political environment. But also you pointed something out here, which is that, why do we need a green space instead of yet another business, right? And again, depending on your context, that could either be an obvious call because the place is just packed with businesses, or, and quite frankly, the case in a lot of parts of Baltimore you want the businesses too, because these places are suffering from a lack of businesses and lack of jobs. And so then you're in a position where you say, okay, how do we collaborate in thinking about how we use all of our spaces effectively, right? And where are the synergies, right? You're focused on pedestrianism. If we're going to get more people on the street, if we're going to get people going to green space destinations, that could be good for the other development, right? It's not zero sum here. So can we quantify the extent possible the benefits? And in addition to that, because quantification is challenging sometimes, do we have the narratives, the examples, right? The analogies, the cross-learning between communities and cities that says, this can be a good idea, right? And then that can either mean a collaborative relationship with whoever's developing the properties, or of course, if it's a less collaborative environment, it can mean getting city government to weigh in a way that creates the rules that you need to get a positive collaboration.
Right, that collaborative approach. And it's good you mentioned, a lot of places are suffering business-wise, and so they need the business, and perhaps there's a way to incorporate the green space, which if designed well, people will be lunching at and having their coffee breaks at, and taking walking calls at. So I actually had a lot in mind when I asked you that question, and the area is very built up business, and I look at it and I say, it would just be, I can just envision people in all this surrounding business complex would flock here if it were a well-designed space. And then also thinking about how to incorporate little commercial entities into such an area, which I think good park designs all across the world offer a great model for that. So, well, I'm very thankful for your time, and I look forward to hopefully more dialogue and maybe a more extended talk, possibly maybe some panel cooperation. If we do any panel talks at Pedestrian Space on urban heat, I would really appreciate your presence and expertise.
Great. Well, thanks so much for the interview, Annika, and thanks for your work on this issue.
Thank you.